Hmm. There we go. Perfect. Morning, everyone. Uh, Today we'll be talking about the Web Experience Toolkit distribution. This is a distribution that's heavily used by the Canadian government, and it was originally created by Canadian government departments that were trying to solve the larger issue of web content management systems. So my name is Stephen Russett. I work with a company called OpenPlus.ca. I originally worked with the City of Ottawa for just over a decade, and I worked on various projects, but the main one was Service Ottawa initiative, which is $80 million over 4 years to completely transform the way that the municipality does its business from a technological perspective. And this touched everything across every touch point with the citizen. So the second that you need to make a request of any kind to when that request is actually fulfilled, we looked at the entire business process. What are all the systems that are enhanced? And web was a constant one that we got into. So we dealt with everything from BI or business intelligence, GIS. We did as-is mapping and to-be mapping and closed-loop processes to make sure that, example, when you get your pothole service request issued, that you get a notification when it's fixed. Very similar to like a Purolator or a UPS or a FedEx. If you need to reach me, you can get me on Twitter, GitHub, or personal email. So I want to make this presentation as interactive as possible, so there'll be lots of demos and stuff to show. Let's talk about the distribution as a whole. So as I said, the distribution is mainly led by the Canadian government. It's used by private companies, NGOs, other government organizations. The distribution as a whole is not owned by any one group. It is completely a truly collaborative project. The main goals for the Canadian government were about multilingual, accessible, integration with the Wet.js library, we'll talk about that in a second, and really having a turnkey option for web content management systems. So the Wet.js library is essentially a build-off of jQuery and Bootstrap. Now, originally it was a build-off of jQuery Mobile, jQuery UI, and a few other libraries, and a custom grid system that they created at the time before they moved to Bootstrap. But it's a government-led initiative that has full-time staff maintaining accessible widgets, multilingual widgets that are all usable and mandated to be used by the federal government. We use this with the City of Ottawa. The work I do with OpenPlus at all 3 levels of government, we use this library. It's a quick way to have out-of-the-box accessibility needs, multilingual needs, and government-grade widgets that are just built that are ready to go. So the main purpose of the distribution was really to stop reinventing how to build a website. Start focusing on your content, your IA, building online services, and not worrying about module selection. Something that we went through over and over again when we looked at, for example, with the City of Ottawa, and we did the as-is and to-be analysis, was every time we were implementing these new systems, we kept looking at reinventing the wheel. What new system could we do? And if it was the same system, it was always a reinvention of how that system was utilized. So when the distribution started to get built for the web content management perspective, it was really the idea of let's make something that's turnkey, that we can reuse over and over again and not have to worry about the small little details. Some high-level features before we jump into some demos. It's fully responsive. It meets WCAG 2.0 out of the box, fully 100% compliant. It is fully multilingual end-to-end, including the installer. So when you install the distribution, it's a multilingual installer as well. Everything that goes through the distribution goes through a CI build, and we inherit tons of BHAT tests out of the box. There is now official, since our 1.0 release, there are upgrade paths and release cycles that occur about once a month with updates. The 2.0 version is about to come out, which is and we'll show this, it's a full upgrade to the original 1X series, and it is a move to the Bootstrap system as well. So Wet 3, which was the JS library, originally had the non-Bootstrap implementation, and now that we're moving to Bootstrap as that main grid system in the library, we're able to inherit a lot of the features. So we've actually been doing a lot of enhancements on the Drupal implementations of Bootstrap. So with the Wet 2X version of the distribution, you essentially get a Bootstrap theme-based system that's ready to go with all your modules chosen. Typical government deployments that we usually deal with here, we need deployment. How do I get my content and my configuration from my various servers? Forms, we use panels, mini panels all out of the box. Full workflow integration. We use Workbench at the moment, but we're transitioning out of Workbench and moving solely to the workflow module. And it's fully UUID and fully entity-based, as well as fully multilingual entity-based across the board. We've developed a first-class content deployment system. So this is really enhancing the purposes of how do I get my content from one server or one server to many servers and be able to push from your dev, staging, production environments. Typical government deployment could look something like this, moving from your local and development servers to your integration, to your showcase, potentially to your content development, and then eventually to your production. With a government-grade distribution, we typically deal with an issue where here there's some sort of firewall where we have a concern about the production system should really only have live content. There should be no revisions. There should be no history. There should be no unpublished content. There should be no deleted content. There should be no extra modules or things that are there. This is a really big deal for big organizations as well as governments that have to deal with the privacy issues and the potential building of content that may take weeks to build, but it's not available for public. And if your site potentially got hacked, you don't want that information there, especially if it has an effect, example, on the economy. We deal with this a lot with Statistics Canada, which is pretty much the lead of the distribution, where they put in the most development hours into the system. And they have an issue where when they release census data, they could have an effect on the economy. And that census data may take weeks to build into the system. So they don't want to have any non-production, non-live content that's sitting on that system. So what we built out, and we're going to demo this, is a fully turnkey solution for deployment that supports this exact model. Where we have there's a few extra lines. An example here is often we deal with, well, production systems, we can push only our live content, but there's content that eventually gets created on production. Example, comments or ratings. How do we get that back? So we've put in place sort of synchronization that goes just for certain tables to go back from production into content development. And so all of your content developers only ever work, if you choose, behind the firewall or in the isolated system. So let's demo that. Hopefully the Wi-Fi works. All right. So this is the Web Experience Toolkit distribution installed, vanilla install, and all I've done is turned on one module for the content development environment and one module for the production environment. So I'll show you what that looks like. So we have two modules. We have the WetKit deployment source, which is your content development, and we have our WetKit deployment destination. And destination is what you put on your production environment or any other server. Once you turn those modules on, everything else gets turned on for you, and you're ready to go. All the views, everything's created. So we're just going to do a sample content. So if we're on the content development server, we're going to go content, add content, and we're just going to say deploy simple. So this is just a sample content type we've created. So we'll do Stephen's test. Pick our language. And all I have to do is check this box. It says deploy this content to the destination site. I'm going to press save. And you'll see that deploy simple, Stephen's test has been syndicated to the destination site. And if I jump over here and look at my content, you'll see it's now there. And if I do an update to that content, so there's my content. And I'm going to save. It's going to syndicate. And now my content's there. For setting this up, it's really just as simple as creating a user on the production system, going to structure, deployment endpoints. Everything has been configured for you. All you have to do is set your user So whatever it may be, I've created a user called deploy and set the URL of your server. And you're done. You don't need to worry about anything else. Everything is taken care of for you. Now, if you don't want to do instantaneous deployments, we also have bulk operations that are completely supported. So if we do dashboard deployment, you'll see that we get this page right here, where we have all our content, and we're able to push that into the queue, and we can have different queues if need be, and you could schedule that to run, or you can run it whenever you need be. So a great example here is a DR system, is if your production system completely went down, really you don't have to worry about any of your content. You just have to redeploy your published content. And so you could just say, select everything, add it to the queue, deploy, and it'll push everything over. So on the production system, there are no revisions that are held there. It is only the published content. You'll also notice that we have beans, files, and users. So this system was built so that any entity is supported for this deployment system. Out of the box, we provide regular content types, beans, files, and users. But if you wanted to create your own custom entity that you wanted to deploy, it's really as simple as a few lines of code to add it in, and you're good to go. Yeah?
How do you deal with related entities between entities? So like a taxonomy term on a concept.
So we use entity references.
To deploy.
So for deployment, it's just all JSON that gets pushed back and forth, and it's through the UUIDs. So as you're deploying content, if there is a related piece of content, you obviously have to deploy that content as well, or else it wouldn't be there. But everything is through UUID, so you make sure no references are ever there from a node ID reference. And so at some point, your node IDs are not going to match up. Right? You're going to have new nodes that node number 6 is not going to necessarily be node 6 on production. But from a UUID perspective, it's all aligned. All right.
So if you were to save that piece of content and it had a new tag that you had in
yes.
the field, if it was all set up correctly, the tag would go and the content would go at the same time.
The reference would go. If
Correct.
you were updating a taxonomy and you created a new taxonomy term, you would have to update that taxonomy as well. So that would be a configuration deployment. So we typically use the configuration management, which is just a backport from D8 to do configuration deployment. So this is purely content deployment that we're worrying about, and we make that separation. So as an example, if you want to deploy a user, that's content. But if you want to make a permission change, that's configuration. And so that would we push that through as a feature or as configuration management. Now you can use the configuration management module, or you can just use it through Drush and Git. So if you look here, so that's configuration management. So you're able to push that. You'd have a vocabulary, and you'd be able to push that through. And it works on the same principles as pushing it through. This is all aligned for D8 as well. So anyone that's seeing demos of D8 and the way that deployment works, it's all based on the exact same principles. And this is leveraging the deploy module. So everything that's built into the system is ensured to be compliant with that deployment. All right. So as I mentioned, our big goal here is WCAG accessibility. Little plug for tomorrow. So we have a larger presentation on accessibility where we talk about the use cases for implementing accessibility, not about how do you make sure that you have the right tags and what are the right tags for accessibility. This is more about the operations management of what it takes for your staff to ensure that your site is accessible and not making it a burden on a day-to-day basis. So we'll talk about the wet widgets in a second and some of the options that are available here. But essentially what we strive to do is to make sure that each of these widgets are implemented in Drupal in various ways, whether that be through views or through a bean or through a content type, whatever it may be, to implement that. So this is charts and graphs, tables, footnotes. We'll go into a few more examples. Multilingual has been an interesting struggle all along the way to have a truly multilingual system. Does anyone here have a deployment for multilingual? No? So one of the biggest issues across the board with multilingual is a lot of modules just aren't internationalized. They don't have their T-strings. They're not set up correctly. There's a lot of date format issues. So French is an interesting one where the translations are different, but also the formatter is not just a typical formatter. There's certain words that have to be added. So there's all sorts of tweaks throughout the system to make sure that this is in there. Out of the box, we support Search API and Solr through multilingual as well. So that's, again, another turnkey component. And through the, again, all alignment with D8 to make sure that we're following the same patterns. So things that are coming down D8 as part of that release cycle, we're making sure that we're not going off on a sort of a tangent. As I mentioned, we have workflow. So currently we use Workbench, moving to workflow fully. Typical moderation issues that we've been dealt with the distribution are dealing with publication workflows, translation workflows, lifecycle workflows of content. So an example there would be, I published my content, but in 6 months I need to make sure that someone reviews it, and I need some sort of workflow to go through that process, and I need a notification and a reminder, and I need to be able to audit that information. And also we have multiple workflows that are tied together in many cases. So this is the ability to do, example, a translation workflow, which is completely separate from a publication workflow, where something may be published, but it may not be translated yet. Also, we have full revisions. Save and edit versus autosave has been an interesting one. So we've implemented save and edit, but from a government perspective, moving more towards document management styles where people like to hit save over and over again as they're producing content, they end up with potentially hundreds of revisions within a single day just because they were saving their content. So it's been an interesting struggle, to say the least. And the other issue with Workbench that we've had to constantly deal with, and it's been resolved now, but it's the whole idea of published content may not necessarily be the most recent content. This becomes a struggle from a bulk operations perspective and dealing with just the system in general of what content are you looking to publish, what information do you want to send over into Solar. So that's all, again, been resolved as part of the distribution. Some key modules that we use: panels, panelizer, mini panels. We have a set of individual modularized components for the wet implementation: rules, beans, deploy, web forms, migrate. We use CK editor, again, in line with D8. Hierarchical select is a heavily used one as well. Also, everything is, as I said, entity-based, so including our files. So we heavily use file entities, which ensures that all our files are fieldable, which then allows us to have a more document management style structure of the system. So let's go through a little more of a demo. There we go. Just want to get rid of that. All right. So I said the distribution makes no judgment calls on how you set up the system. It's really just about providing you a turnkey set of modules that all are working together, that have been tested, that have a release cycle that's set up. This is the 1X branch that I'm showing you. As we jump to the next version, so this is the 2X branch, you'll see, again, alignment with D8 and the way that the menus work. So this is a development environment. You'll see we've also added the ability to choose which environment you're in. So if you look here, you're able to flip between all your different environments that are available. So if someone, for example, on our production system, we let people log into production, but as soon as they log into production, it actually takes them to the content development server. It's completely transparent to them. So they're still able to go to their main system, but it jumps them all automatically through, and that's handled through UUID redirect. So if it, is there a question? No? So again, this is the 2X branch. So this is the Government of Canada base theme, but again, you can flip. So OGPL uses wet as well, and if we jump to that, there's the base theme of OGPL. If we jump to just the core base theme, you'll see there's a completely unbranded version ready for you to theme. Everything is panelized as well. So this is just a regular panel page, and you're able to go through. So let's look at some examples of the widgets. So as I mentioned, the wet.js library is about providing a bunch of widgets that are ready to go for you to utilize. These are all built into the distribution. So for example, if you needed archived content to be able to tell a user that content is archived, so when you scroll down the page, it says this page has been archived, and you're able to customize this message, that's essentially a checkbox now in the distribution. And that is fully utilized, and again, fully accessible, fully multilingual. If we jump to something like charts and graphs, which is a common issue for people to deal with, So this chart is fully accessible, and it's all built in. So all you have to do is leverage it through the views. You have your table, you apply the classes, and it'll start rendering however you need it to be. So for example, this would be all you need to do to add your data, and your table's there. So it's really a table that gets rendered. So we'll see if we look at the code. It's just the table that gets rendered. So let's go back. Footnotes is a good example, often issue with accessibility that we have to deal with. So again, built in, you'll see it selects exactly what you need. Let's go to form validation. So this has all gone through usability testing as well. So everything that's in here, there's reasons why they've chosen to go down this path. The whole idea of leveraging the WET toolkit, and which is mandated by the Canadian government, but why we end up using it with private clients, is there's massive amounts of testing that the government goes through to make sure that these work correctly, but also the users understand how to use them. So all that heavy lifting that you typically have to do, we try and abstract that away and don't have to worry about a lot of it. So in this case, this is a common usability issue and accessibility issue. For when form validation, you not just have to have the form validation error on the field, but also having a list at the top allows the screen reader to be able to quickly know exactly what you're looking for and then click on that error and bring you right to it. And again, being able to say something like required rather than just the star, because again, as you read, depending on your screen reader, as you read it, it may just read it as star first name, not actually as required. So you make assumptions, and again, they've done the research and the studies to make sure that what is the typical implementations of these voiceover systems, whatever it may be. We really want to abstract that away. All right. From an installer perspective, I'll show you a few pictures. There we go. So if you download the distribution, you get your installer, and you just go through the process. It'll download everything. It's completely turnkey. It takes about 20 minutes to install by browser, a few minutes if you do it through Drush, and you're ready to go. I installed it locally. Here we go. I'm out of memory, but this is installed locally. This is just dev. And it's ready to go. You can build off of it. You can use configuration. You could deploy from this system to a production. Again, very, very easy to use. But again, the idea that we're trying to do here is eliminate the need for all the research of modules, everything that government typically goes through. So again, we see this with form. There we go. We see this with forms. So how do we deal with forms? How do we ensure that forms are accessible, multilingual? Now, multilingual is not always an issue for everyone because they don't need to do it, but accessibility is an issue that we all have to deal with. So forms, as I mentioned, I come from an operations management background and the analysis of how do you transform your system, how do you transform your business processes. Something that we really personally strive for in the system is to make sure that you're not just giving the end user, the citizen, the solution. You want to make sure that your staff are able to utilize, or yourself are able to utilize the system, not always have to export everything and use one more system. It's just not a burden for you. So for something like forms, we want to really make sure that we have reporting built in and that people can work right within the system. Configuration deployment. Okay. What's going on here? There we go. So for configuration deployment, as I mentioned, we want to keep everything in code, but we know content is going to be stored in the database. So as I showed in that diagram before, we're able to rsync that data back over as needed, and you keep your production system separate. You still follow your same development protocols that you always use. The WetKit modules for deployment, you can reuse them in your own system as long as you have the core modules that are needed. So you need to be UUID, you need to be entity-based, you need to have your deployment server and your source server and your destination server, but you can deploy it yourself if you wanted to on your own instances. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Migration is a common issue that we deal with. With the Canadian government, they've actually standardized, so they have a common look and feel across all their websites. So every federal government website actually has to use the exact same markup and has to have the exact same look and feel. This helps us a lot with migration because it means that every government website that we ever work on always has the same patterns. So migration becomes really easy. But as a result of that, it means that the work is really repetitive and gets really boring, and migration, while it could be fun sometimes to try and figure out the pattern, it ends up being a tedious task. So one of our developers created something called the Node.js Harvester, which is a Node application using Cheerio that will let you scrape your website, put it into a database. That database is then referenced through REST, and then there's a Drupal migration script that will read that REST and bring in all your data. All you have to do is provide the CSV file and the mappings, and so it's really easy. So what we actually have clients do now is they will produce, let's show that. They will produce a CSV. Essentially, they build it in Excel that looks something like this. They have an ID number. They have an ID number. They provide the URL that they're going to be indexing, what language that content's in. They provide where the title is and where the body is through CSS selectors. And typically, it's the same over and over again. And we can add as many fields as you want. And it doesn't even have to be a CSS selector. If it was a custom title that you need to override, you just provide whatever the title may be. And then when that runs, it's able to bring in all your content. So as part of the distribution, the migration scripts are all built in, ready to go to bring in your content as quickly as possible. We actually use it with 90% of our clients out of the box. Very little configuration that's needed. And it's fully available on GitHub, ready to go. So from the Drupal distribution, we go to WebKit. It's right here. So we call it WebKit, W-E-T-K-I-T. You can download it. There's instructions. It works on Simply Test Me. There's documentation. You can see all the continuous integration builds that are built in. As I mentioned, fully WCAG AA compliance, and that's something that it's not just a nice to have for this distribution, it's mandated by the users, the government that leads it. So it's sort of an always assured component of the system that it will be accessible because the people that are using it have to make it accessible. So it's just kind of a nice to have and that inheritance. So right now you can download the 1.5 stable. The 2x dev is available on GitHub, but it is not posted yet on Drupal.org. There's some whitelisting of the JavaScript libraries that they're going through. If you're looking for the JavaScript library of WebKit, you can utilize their website, which is github.com/wet-boew. And you'll see example the Canada.ca theme. So they're very open source friendly. So this entire theme, which is accessible, so if I skip the main content, and as I jump through the system, everything's your proper accessibility. That is all available. There's a fully open source theme. There are distributions. It's not just for Drupal as well. So if you have internal users that are using, example, SharePoint or WordPress, PHP versions, Drupal, they're all there, all available. Drupal's the most advanced in terms of it just has the most users, the most people contributing back to it, but there's distributions for everything. They also have CodeFests that they run, so it's a very sophisticated group. So we'll do a few more demos, and I'll take any sort of questions, use cases that anyone wants to go through. Does anyone have any use cases they want to share? All right. Let's look at more demos if you'd like. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we see the node edit screen, sort of the interface of your content manager?
Sure. So again, we don't make any assumptions about how you want that to work. Out of the box, we just provide some basic pages. There are some submodules that people use to features that have been built out for more advanced. But if we do something like deploy moderate, see it's all built in. They've updated a few items. So for example, if we look at source, Oh no, it's in 2. What's this one? Yes, so little things like even show blocks. So all the CK editor configurations, we've made assumptions out of the box based on experience of what that configuration should be. Not the 90 buttons that are all turned on, and then you end up having to go through, okay, which ones do we want to turn on, which ones work, which ones don't. So we make decisions about what's there. Again, you can turn whatever else you want on, but this is about out-of-the-box distribution that can work as quickly as possible for your day-to-day operational needs. You shouldn't have to worry about the little decisions. You should just have to worry about your content, your IA, the stuff that you typically have to deal with.
Is that the media module button?
Yes, it is. So one of the reasons why we use media is for the file entity integration, and I have pictures that we'll talk about tomorrow, but I can show you one now. So we use view modes right within media to control image sizes. So here's an example where they're uploading an image, and someone's able to say small image, small padding, medium image, small padding, whatever it may be. And that allows us to enforce both image sizes, but completely abstract the issue of what size should that image be. And this is a real big issue for responsiveness. So at a 320 screen size, if you have a right-aligned image, and that image is 300 pixels wide, 200 pixels wide, and you start to go down, you now have text on the left that potentially stacks up, and you have one word on top of each other that's all stacked. So you want to stay away from that as much as possible. So again, we make assumptions out of the gate and say, what's the smallest image that can be on the page, whether it be for accessibility purposes. Part of the talk tomorrow will also be about how we use file entities to ask questions about the files that you're uploading. So, for example, we use file types. So as part of videos, we have a special file type called WebKit video, which is ensuring that we meet the accessibility standards when we upload videos. So an accessibility standard is you have to have closed captioning. There has to be an image that's provided in case that video can't load. Well, those are mandatory items, and you don't want to have to train the user on what needs to be provided. You force the user to provide that. So if we go to content, files, so here's our video. All right, so let's just re-add that video. And it will sense that it is a MP4. There we go. And because it's an MP4, it now recognizes that there's 2 types of file types that are supported, video and WebKit video. If you didn't have video, it would just default to WebKit video. And when I select WebKit video, it now says I need to provide a name, I need to provide a poster, and I need to provide a caption file for the closed captioning. We heavily use this with PDFs. So to ensure PDF accessibility, we ask questions like, is the PDF accessible? If it's not, we can enforce that no, the PDF must be accessible. We can do uploads to accessibility checkers to do automated tests on that PDF. We can ask questions and do automation to things like how many pages are in the PDF, what type of PDF is this? Like, is it a PDF of a map? Is it a PDF of text? These questions are important from an operations perspective because next thing you know, you'll get a question to say, how many PDFs are in our system? 10,000. Okay? How many are accessible? 9,000. Okay? Of the 1,000 that are not accessible, how long is it going to take to make them accessible? The next question they're going to ask is, well, what type of content is in the PDFs? Is it text? Because that's a lot easier to make accessible than if it was a bunch of images. If it's a bunch of images, it's potentially more costly. So you want to keep track as much information as possible, but you don't want to have to just put a text box and assume that the user is going to know what to put in the system. We make a curated approach as much as possible and send that user down the path to make sure that they make the right decisions when needed. So in this case, we ensure that they upload a poster and we ensure that they upload a caption file. And we leverage the So we, again, leverage the video player that's built as part of WET. It has examples for inline. It has polyfill fallbacks. It leverages YouTube as well. And so you don't have to worry about anything. And again, closed captioning is built in. So here's an example file. And you'll see that your transcript all gets built out. Well, this would just all be part of that file entity that was defined. And then it all gets leveraged automatically by the view. So again, it's abstracting away a lot of the decisions that you have to make on a day-to-day basis and ensuring that this is easy to use as much as possible. We do the same thing for audio players. Here's a YouTube example. So you see, it's really just a accessible layer on top of YouTube. And again, it's leveraging HTML5 as much as possible. So this is actually leveraging the video tag as part of HTML5. What else? Share widgets is an interesting one. If anyone's dealt with compliance of code sets that you're making sure that your share widgets are accessible. So for example, share this page, and something like this comes up. Often people will try and hack the code for like add this or share this, but if you actually follow the TOC, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to make modifications and then store it on your site and redistribute it as part of a distribution. So they've sort of built their own based off of the jQuery version and ensured that it is, again, fully accessible, fully multilingual, turnkey. It's just a little bit of code to add this. It's essentially all you have to do. And it gets added in. Yes?
Do you know the link checker?
Yes, so that is built in as part of the distribution. So if we go to production, so it's right there. So it's just built in as one of the decision points. Pretty much every government website needs to have some sort of link checking that's built in. We'll run it on the content development server rather than the production server, keep production as minimal as possible, and ensure optimizations. Yeah.
Are U.S. accessibility standards and Canadian accessibility standards the same?
Very close. So Canadian accessibility standards are just based on WCAG AA compliance. The U.S. accessibility standards is the 508, but they're almost mirrored. The 508 is really just a little out of date with the latest accessibility standards, but for years they've been talking about updating the 508 to match the latest. But yeah, they're basically the same exact requirements. The W3C, requirements for WCAG is just what the Canadian government follows. And again, all of that, if you're interested, TS standards. The Canadian government's very open about everything that they do for their web standards. So an example here, every standard, every decision point about why they design their website in a certain way, all the little pixels, everything, why is this 9 pixels high or 10 pixels high, this is all available. If you just type in TBS web standards, you'll get everything. Example, web accessibility, so all the different acts, all their standards, how to meet those standards. So you'll see consequences, all that sort of stuff. They also have great content on how to deal with rot exercises. So if you need to train any of your staff on reducing redundant, outdated, and trivial content, they have full documentation on how to deal with this. So the typical SOP with the Canadian government is the group called the Treasury Board Secretariat will generate the policies, make that all available, and all the departments will then utilize that information. Rather than placing it solely on an intranet, they make it fully available to the public, and it's really great for us to re-leverage. Yes? We have CAPTCHA as part of the form system. We'll typically use Honeypot more, just because CAPTCHA seems to be a little more problematic. And one of the weird things about CAPTCHA is when you're logged in, it doesn't provide the CAPTCHA. It's an administration usability issue. For users that don't know that the CAPTCHA is there, they'll be logged in, and they'll say, hey, where's the CAPTCHA? But it's only there for non-authenticated users. As well as the other issue with the CAPTCHAs we find is it's a weird way to add them. You have to go to the CAPTCHA configuration and add the form rather than adding the CAPTCHA on the form. So when you're editing the form, typically the expected experience is, check a box to say turn on CAPTCHA. But it's the other way around. They got to go to CAPTCHA and add the form. And so it's just a usability thing.
Sorry, so how do you
Yes, that's another Drupal module. Basically what it does is it places a fake field or a hidden field that bots will fill in. And when that field is filled in, then you can't submit the form. So to the user, the field isn't available, but to a bot that's just filling out every form field on the page, that field would get filled out, and then the system won't accept the form submission.
Another one called Botcha.
Okay.
Botcha. Gotcha. This is has a variety of bot catching things.
If anyone creates modules here, please provide photos with your modules. It's a habit of the Drupal community not to do it. Photos are invaluable. All right, here we go. So all the different components. We also typically run Alasia cron as part of the distribution. It just ends up being more operationally friendly. You had a question? Yes.
Do you know of any federal government?
I don't know of any U.S. federal government. There was a presentation last year. There's definitely been interest. The OGPL program, which the U.S. government is part of, does use it. There we go. But I don't know any U.S. federal government that currently uses it yet. Yes. As I said, it's turnkey. It's ready to go. You just really need to theme it. So if we look at the 2.0 branch, which is probably the better one to be at right now, you're good to go. It even, it has things built in too to check just a little usability enhancements, so you can try it on different versions. Yes.
When you get to 2.0, you have to go to GitHub.
As soon as the whitelist issue is fixed, and I was talking with someone about it a little earlier, it'll be, if not this week.
Is it worth waiting for the two really, like, if you're someone who's like, I want to use this, I want to test it out.
Yeah.
And potentially really use it. Is it worth waiting for the two?
We'll go ahead and test the 1.5 version, so the one that's out right now. It's all ready to go. The 2x version is better. There's all sorts of enhancements to it, but like I said, there's a few issues that we're just dealing with getting certain JavaScript libraries whitelisted on Drupal.org.
But you could get it right now.
You could, yes, but it's not packaged. That's the only other issue. So if you download it from Drupal.org, it's completely packaged, ready to go. Here, I can even just show you what that looks like. So let's do.
So the enhancements aren't enough to wait. Like, say, go ahead and go with 1.5.
Yeah, and by the time, like, if you're just testing it, you're good to go. Start testing it.
Yeah.
By the time you're like, yeah, we're going to actually implement this, 2.0 will be out long ago. All right, so let's go import.
I would expect that if the U.S. government was going to use it, they'd have to add Spanish as a second language.
Sure.
For a lot of them,
Yeah.
Particularly the state of California.
Yeah, it's completely multilingual, so it doesn't matter what language you're adding. So if you've never seen what multilingual looks like, so on your content, you're able to go to the Translate tab. And because we use entity translation, it's actually down to a field level. So every field can be specifically defined of whether or not that field is translated. So an example would be something like a taxonomy field. There's very few use cases where you actually need to translate a taxonomy field. Typically, you pick the taxonomy selection on the English page or whatever your primary language is, and then that's the same selection that's applied automatically on the translated page. So at a per field level, you're able to define that translation. So example here, I have English and French. If I add my French, it'll do the synchronization. Come on, internet. There we go. So you'll see that all the fields synchronize. So I'm able to add those in and just change it to whatever it may be. We use path breadcrumbs, path auto breadcrumbs. The name escapes me, but we use that for the breadcrumb system. So again, it's very, very flexible, fully translated. The key here from a translation perspective is everything is translatable, like cross-board. There's no, oh, by the way, and because we use beans, that isn't translatable. It's everything is translatable. And that's a really inheritance from the fact that the government agencies that use it are mandated to ensure that everything is translatable. They can't have exceptions. So it's perfect for example, like a US government department, if they needed to do Spanish, again, it's ready to go. There's no configurations. And multilingual is one of those continual issues that we always dealt with of how do we ensure that everything can be multilingual. How are we doing on time? So we're at 1 o'clock. Does anyone have any final questions? Perfect. Thank you very much.